Next, I'd like to welcome Mr. Sean Unwin. He is a senior pharmacist with the Infection Management Department at Metro South, and he'll be speaking to us today about accessing non-TGA medicines as sort of clearly articulated by Canthi, the challenges that are ahead of us. He has worked for almost 20 years, both in Australia, the UK, and Asia, and also worked with Queensland Health at local and statewide levels in medicine logistics with a focus on improving access to imported antimicrobials. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sam. And thanks for the invite to speak today. I'm not going to present any clinical trial data. This is going to be a much simpler talk. I'll get you to lunch. I'm going to focus on antibiotics, not medicines generally, but a lot of this obviously applies to other medications that aren't antibiotics as well. I'm just going to touch on the need for unregistered antimicrobial. We'll talk a bit about different pathways for access. I'll try and keep that pragmatic. And I will touch on a couple of case examples with antifungals particularly. So what do we need to use unregistered antibiotics? So the first thing is new antibiotics don't come to market quickly. So Kanthi's already talked about the development process from a pharma point of view. But additionally, the registration process can take quite some time. The Australian healthcare market is relatively small, as we all know, and the priority is for the North American and the European markets. So drugs tend to go there first, which makes sense. And the TGA registration process is costly and increasingly lengthy. So there's an increasing number of new applications. It's roughly bumping up about 20% per annum at the moment, which is significant. And there's limited resources to assess those. So things are kind of slowing down and timelines are stretching well beyond a year. So none of that is particularly inviting for a pharma company. And it gives us this gap between having a registered product available overseas and having it here. Agents also leave the market. Many of us are familiar with these situations. They're quite frustrating. So maintaining and updating TGA registration and a market presence, that costs money, significant money. And antimicrobials have a very limited patient market generally. They can be quite cheap, low numbers of people. Why would you keep a drug like that on the market? It's not very attractive. You also have the risk of generic competitors. So if you bring a generic into the market, you may have a competitor come in later and sort of subvert you. So that's a risk. And manufacturers can withdraw not just from the Australian market, but from many markets around the world. And that puts increasing pressure on trying to access these drugs. And there's just a couple of examples there of recent antibiotics that have fallen off the Australian market, one imipenem and more recently, praziquantel. We also have medicine shortages. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. This is an increasing problem in recent years, even before COVID. And it's not an Australian problem, it's a global problem. And the precipitants for this problem are varied. So it can be as simple as just increasing global demand. And we did see that during COVID for various antibiotics, some of which made no difference. And then there's consolidation of manufacturing, and that can occur with the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or the API as we call it, or a final formulation product. So companies are sort of consolidating their processes. There's less companies making these things. The profit margins are lower. That kind of makes sense. But then when you do have market withdrawals, there's increased pressure on these systems. There's also manufacturing issues. Companies talked about that happening with an investigational product, and it happens with registered products. Those of you that were involved in the acetaconazole trials years ago now, they had to restart twice. Once because it got bought by another company, but also because there was manufacturing issues with that compound. We also have more unexpected problems like natural disasters and significant accidents. Again, many of you will remember in 2017 issues we had trying to get access to Piptaz because the major API producer in the world, which was in China, had a major fire in their factory. Wasn't that fun to deal with. And then what does the TGA do about shortages? Well, they have some instruments to try and help with this. They can grant these so-called Section 19 approvals for selected medicines. It's not sought in all cases, though, and that's just a temporary registration they apply. They try and choose specific formulations that have GMP certification that's very similar to Australia. So it's just selected countries around the world. This is a global zero-sum game. So when there are shortages, the pressure's everywhere. So we still have to rely sometimes on parallel importing drugs through the SAS scheme to manage that. And as Kathy's touched on as well, we have this desire to use investigational products that haven't yet been registered in any country, whether it's the EU or the US. And these are obviously for specific patient needs, often very desperate, life-threatening infections. We've exhausted all the other antibiotics that we have available, or we're having issues with toxicity. So these are drugs in phase 2, phase 3 trials. And you might have a current clinical trial platform available globally for that, but maybe it's not in your country, at your site, or your patient doesn't meet the selection criteria for that trial. We have to try and work around that if possible. I'll just touch on pathways for access. Try and keep this as pragmatic as possible. So the legal framework for this is pretty straightforward. The TGA, operating under the Infectious Goods Act, operates a special access scheme. We're all familiar with that, I presume. We complain about that a bit, don't we? But honestly, having worked in different places around the world, it's a very good setup. We have very limited barriers to getting things into the country in Australia, which is great. So this is for exceptional circumstances. Obviously, you can't be asking for something when you've got a listed product that could do the same job. You need informed patient consent. I don't think we did that well, to be honest. You also have to agree to report any ADEs to the TGA. I think likewise, that's probably happening that much. And the TGA can, but very seldom, will audit practices on what people are doing with special access drugs. The TGA also operates the scheme under which we can access investigational products, and that's referred to as CTN or CTX, which essentially is also SAS. So these are the practical questions I have when we're thinking about accessing a non-registered product for a patient. First one clearly is it still investigational, or has it been on the market somewhere around the world? Secondly, how quickly do we need to get it? And that's going to impact what path I'm going to choose to try and get that drug. What might be that time frame? Different pathways have different time frames. What's the likely cost? So, some of our SAS drugs can be horrendously expensive, up to $4,000 a day. But some are basically free, including investigational products, where you might only be maybe paying for transport costs, but perhaps not even that. And then also additionally, you need to consider whether you've got any local governance requirements at your place of work. Typically, that's going to involve dealing with your med super or delegate to get approval. I think it's fair to say most of that pathway is pretty straightforward still in Australia. Not too many barriers. This is a proposed decision tree that I put together. So starting on the top left, first question is, do you have investigational drug? If yes, well, you have to contact the IP producer and figure out what that process is. They're normally pretty happy to talk to you and then explain whether or not you've got half a chance of getting it and how to go about that. And I will touch on a case for Laura from how to do that. If not, it's registered somewhere else. Well, do you have it in your pharmacy? And many pharmacists keep stock on hand of various drugs. If not, can you utilize a Australian-based SAS wholesaler to get that drug fairly rapidly? You can't get it fast enough through them, and you borrow that from another hospital, whether that be one down the road. Last night I stole some drugs from this hospital to take back to the PA. Thank you very much, Nicolette Graham, if she's in the audience. Otherwise, perhaps somewhere else in Queensland or even interstate. And we do a lot of sharing and borrowing of medicines around the country, which is great. And then if you can't get it from another hospital, well, you're going to have to revisit going back to the supplier and maybe bracing a longer time frame, unfortunately. And all of that obviously still requires an SAS submission. It's pretty straightforward. So local hospital pharmacies, as I said, they keep a range of SAS antimicrobials. Queensland Health Sites can also access central pharmacy, which keeps some SAS stock, but not all SAS stock, and not a consistent supply, I think it's fair to say. So we do still rely on each other to borrow and share. There's a network of ID pharmacists who talk to each other about it, who's got stock of what, so can rapidly assess where things are, and that's not just within Queensland, but around Australia. In Queensland, we also have access to a statewide database where we can essentially search each hospital and try and figure out what stock is where. So I could easily last night figure out that each hospital doesn't indeed have what I want. And interstate, that's not as easy. Obviously, there's no one system in Australia for stock management between hospitals, so we have to reach out to colleagues and try and figure out who's got what where. Occasionally, you can also deal directly with the SAS wholesalers in Australia and find out where they've been sending stock to. and which is a bit sneaky, but sometimes they will tell you that, and you can then track down that hospital and figure out if they're willing to lend to you or not. We've certainly done that before. So the PA, this is just antimicrobials, which represents about, I'd say, 40% of all our imported unregistered medicines that we keep. So it's the lion's share, really. And I'll try to split that up into different sort of treatment groups, like GMB, GPC, fungal, viral, and mycobacteria, and other. So you'd be very familiar with a lot of those drugs, but that's what we routinely keep on the shelf. You'll notice a lot of them sitting in there as well. And many of you will have had to use those agents at various times. And globally, where do we get it all from? We get it from a lot of places. We try, like the TGA, to engage with countries which will have the more reliable GMP processes, but we can't always do that. But North America, typically Europe, our colleagues across the pond in New Zealand, but we also have to access drugs from other places where the TGA would not normally consider GMP to be comparable. So the Australian SAS wholesalers, there's numerous of them at the moment. There didn't used to be. It used to be kind of a monopoly, to be fair. It's problematic. But now there's multiple players in the market, so it's quite competitive, which is good. Competitive in terms of prices, and competitive in terms of turnaround times. So they're all trying to improve themselves, which is good. Good for us. Each of them has a network of global suppliers that they interact with, whether that be the original manufacturers or overseas wholesalers. And they try and keep a range of stock on hand based on demand. So, often we have conversations with them about future demand, what we think is going to be happening, and, would you be interested in keeping certain stock in advance so that we don't have to keep hassling you and dealing with long lead times. And they're pretty good at having those discussions and understanding with us that those needs are real. And importantly, they will manage the import permits that are required in the TGA to deal with Australian customs. So you can't just bring an antibiotic into the country on a ship. Customs will block that unless you have the right paperwork. So they deal with that side of it, which can take a bit of time and a little bit of money, but not much, to be honest. You can do that yourself, but I won't talk about that today because very few people do that. There's a couple of unusual pathways to get unregistered meds. So there's the National Medical Stockpile, which many of you will have at least heard about through COVID times, because many of the COVID drugs were stored by them and distributed by them. They have a range of other products now. So TPOXX, for example, that's been used at various sites, including our own. Ibuprofen, some other antitoxin vaccines. They keep all of these things and they distribute them through various networks around Australia. It's different state by state. In Queensland, that's managed through Central Pharmacy, essentially. Central Pharmacy also keep in parallel their own sort of separate stockpile of diphtheria antitoxin, which is also unregistered, as you expect. And the pathway for this additionally involves approval from an ID physician, but also the Chief Health Officer to access that stockpile. And they'd be pretty similar in other states. Sometimes they use veterinary products on our patients. I guess the most common example of this is strongyloides hyperinfection, where we use ivermectin subcutaneously. I've done that many times at the PA hospital. And then occasionally when we have issues accessing trucklebendazole, Shiola, we have to access that from the vet. Although currently now there's a pretty good supply of that in the country at one of the wholesalers. To access vet products, it's fairly straightforward. You obviously just get the product from the vet, pretty easy. And then you have to get approval from the Chief Health Officer, which again is fairly straightforward. It's good to know that the pathway exists, and it's covered under in Queensland, it's covered under the Medicine and Poisons Act. Some additional considerations when we're looking at using imported drugs. Firstly, is GMP standard, which I've kind of alluded to, but you can get in trouble with these. So that first photo there, WHO GMP approved stamp, it's a fake stamp on a product that we were offered at one point. It was clearly fake. There's a lot of that around the world, unfortunately, still. And we know there's issues with fake drugs being sold in different parts of the world. Possibly most famously, drugs like artesunate, malaria treatment, but a range of drugs. And then the product packaging and support materials may not quite be up to your needs. So obviously language is the most obvious thing. Some of these labels have no English on them at all whatsoever, so you'll have to sort of relabel things. And then additionally, if you've got nurses, doctors, pharmacists trying to access resources around those drugs, They may have a bit of trouble trying to find that information in Australian-based resources, although I do think that's getting better and better. And then when it comes to investigational antimicrobials that aren't on the market yet anywhere, so we have to approach the sponsor company, and typically you'll be directed to a web portal these days to manage that, and they'll usually send you some process documents as well. They may also link you in with an SAS importer here in Australia who will kind of manage that process. There'll be some minimum requirements, patient consent, obviously, a bunch of other kind of paperwork, and you will also have a responsibility to report back ADEs and outcomes in a similar fashion that you would for a clinical trial, really. And I'll talk about this. I'll break this down in terms of the Lorifim, which I know some of you have already used, and Kathy's already touched on. So not approved yet, as we know, but hopefully coming. So this is our chap we treated last year with Lorifim. So he had disseminated lamentospora, a background of severe IgG disease, heavily immunosuppressed, and he additionally had CNS, crypto, and PJP, his troubles. And he was intolerant of multiple antifungals. He had severe AKI with Anticeris, and it was ongoing, and he had a DILI, which was attributed to a combination of worry, terbinafine, and 5-FC. So we sought access to a Lorifim from F2G for him, in addition to continuing to use voriconazole for his crypto. So the pathway is actually pretty straightforward and pretty friendly. So F2G utilizes Clinigen to manage all this. Clinigen is a massive company globally, one of the biggest importer-exporters of unregistered meds. And they also own Link Australia, which is biggest Australian importer-exporter of unregistered medications. So Link essentially assists with this process, and they'll give you additional documentation to help you along the way. They'll set up a login, and then you log in, you select your Lorifim program, and you start creating patient, prescriber, and pharmacy profiles. And they'll also give you these documents. They'll give you a clinical guide, they'll give you an operational guide, and also give you the actual investigator brochure as if you were part of the clinical trial. But this is not a clinical trial technically, and you're getting it through this pathway. You submit all that. Obviously, the SAS form has to be there as well. Patient consent, it's access request form, and as Kathy's alluded to, there's a bit of a delay on it. There's a bit of time involved. So they'll say they can assess your access request within 2 to 5 days. It was pretty quick for us. And they ship that out of the UK within a week. And I believe we got it within 9 days from start to finish. It arrived on a Friday afternoon, and we started at that night. Nice one. And then additionally, locally, you might have some additional needs to meet. So for us, that involved getting our chair of drug and therapeutics to at least verbally approve this process because of the urgent need. But then in the background, we have to provide some additional documentation for them, which is fair enough. Some of the same documentation we're providing to FTG. And there's ongoing requirements. So we receive the drug, we started it. The ongoing requirements are reporting ADEs, again, much in the same way as you would for clinical trial, and then discontinuation forms and outcome forms at the end of therapy. And unfortunately, our gentleman passed away. That's it, those forms. And there's also an obligation to destroy any remaining stock that you have on hand. So you can't just keep it on the shelf and use it on the next patient without talking to the company, nor can you actually shed a stock between sites without a clear approval from FTG to do that. We have been caught out in the past with other hospitals wanting to use investigational drugs that we've had without going through that process, which is always very awkward. Because, they know we've got the drug and they really want it. They've got a desperate patient need, but we just can't pick it up. So I'll touch on two cases now. The second case now. This is involving azoles. Casting mine back more than 20 years to when these drugs were relatively new, including Amy's favourite drug, second favourite drug, voriconazole. So this young lady had CGD and hyper IgE Job syndrome. She had recurrent multifocal aspergillosis involving CNS and spine. She had surgery, antidepressant B, interferon gamma. She was maintained but not well on a high dose of itraconazole. So we applied to Pfizer for compassionate voriconazole, which at the time was unregistered in Australia. And they granted that to us. So we started her on voriconazole therapy. And not long after, she developed a severe photosensitivity reaction. And that was not a well-known ADR at the time. So a bit of a surprise. We had to continue her on that because there was realistically no alternative therapy. And she progressed to develop multifocal invasive SCCs that required radical surgery and radiotherapy. On the background of that, we then applied for compassionate access to posaconazole, which also wasn't on the market yet. And it took 3 attempts to get that approved, but third time's the charm. That was actually facilitated through a clinical trial pathway rather than a strict compassionate access pathway. And the person sued, he did resolve, but unfortunately he did pass away base of SCC sometime later. So investigational agents, the access isn't guaranteed. It may take a while to get it. The pathways can be different. There are pharmacovigilance requirements, which is fair enough. And these ADE risks of these novel agents can be unforeseen and sometimes quite severe. And I'll leave it at that. And just to acknowledge people I work with locally, other pharmacists around Australia that help us with accessing these drugs. And a particular tip of the hat to WHO GDF, who've been very helpful in helping us facilitate access to TB drugs. Thank you very much.